Picture this: two of history's most profound thinkers, separated by 15 centuries, sitting across from each other in a dimly lit tavern. The question hanging between them isn't just academic, it's the most personal question any human being can ask. Is your body your prison, or is it the very source of everything meaningful in your existence? Tonight we witness an impossible conversation. In one corner, Augustine of Hippo, the 4th century philosopher whose spiritual struggle with his own flesh shaped Christian thought for millennia. Across from him, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the 20th century French phenomenologist who revolutionized how we understand embodied experience. Both brilliant, both passionate, both convinced they hold the key to understanding what it means to be human. The tavern is quiet except for the crackling fire and the gentle clink of glasses. Augustine, his weathered face illuminated by candlelight, traces patterns on the wooden table with his finger. His eyes carry the weight of a man who has wrestled with desire, sin, and redemption. Merleau-Ponty, younger but no less intense, leans forward with the eager energy of someone who has discovered something revolutionary about human existence. "You know," Augustine begins, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has lived through profound transformation, "I spent years trapped in my own flesh. Every pleasure, every desire, every moment of physical satisfaction, it all led me further from truth, further from God." Merleau-Ponty sets down his glass with a gentle thud. "But Augustine, what if that's exactly backward? What if your body wasn't leading you away from truth? What if it was the very way you encountered truth in the first place?" The fire pops, sending shadows dancing across their faces. Augustine's expression hardens slightly, not with anger, but with the certainty of someone who has found solid ground after years of spiritual quicksand. "Maurice, you speak as a man who has never truly experienced the war between flesh and spirit. I lived it. Every day, every moment, my body pulled me toward things that corrupted my soul. The appetites, the lusts, the endless hunger for physical satisfaction, they were chains binding me to illusion." "But wait," Merleau-Ponty interrupts, his hands moving expressively as he speaks. "You're describing your body as if it were separate from you, as if you existed somehow apart from your physical being. That's the fundamental error. You don't have a body. You are your body. Your consciousness isn't trapped inside flesh like a prisoner in a cell. Your consciousness is embodied consciousness." Augustine leans back, studying his opponent with the keen eye of someone accustomed to theological debate. "You're playing word games, my friend. The soul is clearly distinct from the body. The soul seeks eternal truth, beauty, goodness, the unchanging realities of God. The body seeks temporal pleasures that fade and ultimately disappoint. How can you deny this basic experience that every thoughtful person recognizes?" The question hangs in the air like incense. Merleau-Ponty takes a slow sip of his drink, collecting his thoughts. When he speaks again, his voice carries the passion of someone unveiling a hidden truth, because experience itself proves you wrong. Right now, as we sit here debating, how are you understanding my words? Through your ears. How are you reading my expressions, my gestures? Through your eyes, how do you know the warmth of that fire, the texture of that wooden table, the taste of your wine? Every single meaningful encounter with reality comes through your embodied being. Augustine nods slowly, acknowledging the point without conceding it. Yes, the soul uses the body as an instrument, but the soul itself, the thinking, knowing, choosing part of us, exists beyond the physical. When I think about mathematical truths, about the nature of justice, about God, these thoughts aren't material. They point to a reality beyond flesh. But even those thoughts, Merleau-Ponty counters, emerge from an embodied mind. You can't think about justice without drawing on experiences of fairness and unfairness that you've lived through your body. You can't contemplate beauty without having seen, heard, touched beautiful things. Your most abstract thoughts are rooted in embodied experience. The debate is heating up, but both men remain respectful, united in their quest for truth, even as they disagree about its source. Augustine leans forward now, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "Maurice, you're missing the deeper point. Yes, we use our bodies to encounter the world, but the problem is that our bodies consistently mislead us. They make temporary things seem permanent, physical pleasures seem ultimately satisfying, finite realities seem infinite. The wise person learns to distinguish between the messages of the flesh and the truths of the spirit." Merleau-Ponty's eyes light up with the intensity of someone who sees exactly where his opponent is going wrong. "No, Augustine, you're creating a false division. Your body doesn't mislead you. It reveals the world to you in all its complexity and ambiguity. Yes, pleasures are temporary. Yes, physical things fade. But that's not a flaw in embodied experience. That's the very nature of meaningful existence. The fire crackles again, and both men pause, letting the weight of their disagreement settle between them. They're not just debating philosophy. They're wrestling with the fundamental question of how to live, how to understand suffering, how to find meaning in a world where bodies age, desires conflict, and death approaches. What happens when these two titans of thought really dig into their deepest convictions? The night is just beginning. The tavern seems to grow quieter as Augustine settles into his argument, the way a cathedral grows silent before a sermon. His hands fold deliberately on the table, and when he speaks, there's the gravity of someone who has stared into the abyss of human nature and emerged with uncomfortable truths. Let me tell you what I learned in those years before my conversion, Maurice. I was brilliant, successful, surrounded by pleasures and possibilities. I had lovers, I had acclaim, I had everything the body could desire, and I was miserable, not occasionally, not just during difficult periods, fundamentally, essentially miserable. Merleau-Ponty shifts in his chair, not dismissively but with the careful attention of someone trying to understand an alien perspective. But Augustine, what if that misery wasn't caused by having a body? What if it was caused by fighting against your embodied nature, by treating your physical existence as somehow inferior or corrupt? Augustine's laugh is rueful, tinged with the pain of memory. You think I was fighting my nature? I was indulging it completely. Every appetite, every desire, every impulse, I followed them all. That's exactly what led to such profound unhappiness. The body promises satisfaction, but delivers only temporary relief, followed by deeper hunger. Wait. Stop right there, Merleau-Ponty says, his voice gaining energy. You're describing addiction, compulsion, disconnection from meaningful embodied experience. That's not what I mean by embracing our embodied nature. When I touch this glass, I'm not seeking endless pleasure. I'm encountering reality. When I look into your eyes as we debate, I'm not indulging an appetite. I'm connecting with another consciousness through the most intimate possible means. Augustine considers this carefully. Despite their disagreement, he's clearly taking Merleau-Ponty seriously. But don't you see the problem with your examples? That glass will break. These eyes will grow dim and eventually close forever. The body you're so fond of will age, weaken, and die. If embodied experience is the source of meaning, then meaning itself is temporary, fragile, ultimately tragic. Merleau-Ponty leans back, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Exactly. And that's what makes it meaningful. Meaning doesn't require permanence, Augustine. In fact, permanence might be the enemy of meaning. The fact that this conversation will end, that our bodies will age, that this moment is unrepeatable, that's precisely what gives it weight and significance. How can you say that? Augustine's voice carries genuine bewilderment. If everything physical is temporary, if all embodied experience ends in death, then what's the point? Why struggle? Why create? Why love? Why seek truth? You're describing a universe of ultimate futility. The question hits something deep in Merleau-Ponty, and his response comes from a place of profound conviction. Because the alternative you're proposing, this eternal disembodied truth, isn't human truth at all. It's an abstraction that removes us from everything that actually matters. When a mother holds her newborn child, is she wrong to find that meaningful because the child will eventually die? When lovers touch, is their connection worthless because their bodies will age? Augustine's expression softens slightly, but his conviction remains firm. Those experiences are beautiful, Maurice. I don't deny their beauty, but they're beautiful precisely because they point beyond themselves to eternal realities. The love between mother and child reflects divine love. The connection between lovers echoes the soul's longing for union with God. The body can be a window to the eternal, but we must not mistake the window for what lies beyond it. But that's exactly what I'm arguing against, Merleau-Ponty responds, his passion evident. You're treating embodied experience as merely symbolic, as if the real meaning exists somewhere else. What if the meaning is right here, right now, in the actual experience itself? What if there is no beyond? And this is where meaning lives. Augustine shakes his head slowly. Then you're trapped in an illusion, my friend. A beautiful illusion, perhaps, but still an illusion. Tell me this. When you experience injustice, when you see cruelty or suffering, doesn't something in you cry out that this is wrong, not just socially or culturally, but fundamentally wrong? Where does that sense of objective moral truth come from if there's nothing beyond the physical world? Merleau-Ponty pauses, recognizing the sophistication of the challenge. It comes from our embodied experience of living with others. We understand injustice because we have bodies that can be harmed, because we live in communities where our actions affect other embodied beings. Morality isn't written in some eternal realm, it emerges from the conditions of embodied existence. But that makes morality merely conventional, Augustine objects. If moral truth comes only from embodied experience, then different bodies, different communities, different historical periods could have completely different moral truths. There would be no basis for saying that slavery is absolutely wrong or that cruelty is absolutely evil. The challenge hangs in the air like smoke from the fire. Merleau-Ponty feels its weight, but he doesn't retreat. Instead, he leans forward with renewed intensity. Augustine, you're assuming that embodied experience is purely subjective and variable, but that's not true. We share fundamental aspects of embodied existence. We all have vulnerable bodies. We all depend on others for survival and flourishing. We all experience pain and pleasure, connection and isolation. These shared conditions of embodied life give us a common ground for ethical understanding. Augustine nods thoughtfully. I grant that we share certain physical experiences, but you're still describing a foundation built on sand. Bodies change. Societies evolve. Even our most basic physical experiences can be altered by technology or circumstance. How can you build ultimate meaning on such shifting ground? The firelight flickers across both faces as they grapple with questions that have haunted humanity for millennia. Neither man is backing down, but something deeper is happening. They're beginning to understand the full implications of their disagreement. This isn't just about philosophy, it's about how to live, how to love, how to face suffering and death with dignity and purpose. The atmosphere in the tavern shifts as Augustine reaches for his wine, his movements deliberate and contemplative. When he sets the glass down, there's a different quality to his attention, less defensive, more exploratory, as if he's genuinely trying to understand how someone as thoughtful as Merleau-Ponty could see the world so differently. Maurice, let me approach this from another angle. You speak of embodied experience as if it's self-interpreting, as if meaning simply emerges naturally from physical interaction with the world. But consider language itself. Right now, we're using words to communicate thoughts that go far beyond anything merely physical. These words point to concepts, arguments, truths that exist independently of the sounds we're making or the marks we might write on paper. Merleau-Ponty's eyes brighten with the recognition of a worthy challenge. But, Augustine, that's exactly my point. Language doesn't exist in some disembodied realm, it's fundamentally embodied. Watch my hands as I speak. Listen to the rhythm of my voice. See how my whole body participates in meaning-making. We don't just think words and then externalize them through our bodies. Our thinking is embodied thinking. You're conflating the vehicle with the content, Augustine responds, but there's less certainty in his voice now. Yes, we use our bodies to communicate, but the truths we communicate transcend their physical expression. Mathematical equations, logical arguments, moral principles, these would be true even if no physical beings existed to think them. Merleau-Ponty leans forward, sensing an opening. Would they, though? Take mathematics. You learned to count on your fingers, didn't you? You learned geometric concepts by manipulating physical objects. Even our most abstract mathematical thinking is rooted in embodied experience of space, time, and quantity. We don't discover mathematical truths in some platonic heaven. We develop them through embodied interaction with the world. Augustine pauses, genuinely considering this. But surely you admit that 2 + 2 = 4 regardless of whether any physical beings exist to think it. I admit that if beings like us existed, they would likely develop similar mathematical concepts because they would have similar embodied experiences. But mathematical truth as we understand it is human truth, developed by beings with bodies like ours, living in a world structured in ways that make certain mathematical relationships useful for survival and flourishing. The exchange is becoming more nuanced, less about scoring points, and more about genuinely exploring the implications of their different worldviews. Augustine runs his hand through his hair, a gesture that ironically illustrates Merleau-Ponty's point about embodied thinking. Let me grant, for the sake of argument, that our thinking is more embodied than I initially suggested. But doesn't this actually strengthen my position? If our bodies shape our thinking so fundamentally, then we need some way to transcend bodily limitations to reach objective truth. The body's influence on thought is precisely why we need to disciplined spiritual practice to purify our thinking from bodily distortions. Merleau-Ponty shakes his head vigorously. No, Augustine, you're still thinking in terms of contamination and purification. What if bodily influence isn't a distortion to be overcome, but the very condition that makes truth possible? What if truth isn't something we discover by escaping our embodied nature, but something we create through engaging more fully with it? Create truth? Augustine's voice carries a note of alarm. Maurice, if truth is created rather than discovered, then you've made truth subjective and arbitrary. Different people, different cultures, different historical periods could create completely different truths. How do you distinguish between truth and error, between wisdom and folly? The question strikes at the heart of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy, and he takes a moment to formulate his response carefully. Not arbitrary, Augustine, constrained by the structure of embodied experience and tested through engagement with the world and with others. When I say we create truth, I don't mean we invent it out of nothing. I mean we develop it through the ongoing process of embodied beings encountering reality together. Augustine leans back, studying his opponent with newfound respect, mixed with continued disagreement. So you're saying that truth emerges from collective embodied experience, rather than being imposed from above or discovered through pure reason? Exactly. And that makes truth more robust, not less. Truth that emerges from embodied engagement with reality has been tested against the full complexity of human experience. It's not the product of disembodied speculation, but of lived wisdom. But lived wisdom varies dramatically across cultures and historical periods, Augustine objects. The embodied experience of a Roman slaveholder was different from that of a medieval monk, which was different from that of a modern factory worker. If truth emerges from embodied experience, how do we adjudicate between these different truths? Merleau-Ponty nods, acknowledging the complexity of the challenge. Through dialogue, through encounter, through the ongoing process of embodied beings sharing their experiences and testing their insights against one another. Truth isn't something we possess, it's something we approach through the endless conversation of embodied consciousness. The endless conversation, Augustine repeats slowly. But conversations end, Maurice. Bodies die. If truth depends on the ongoing dialogue of embodied beings, then truth itself is as mortal as the bodies that create it. For the first time in their debate, Merleau-Ponty seems genuinely troubled by Augustine's challenge. He stares into the fire for a long moment before responding. Maybe that's not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be accepted. Maybe the mortality of truth is what makes it precious. Maybe meaning doesn't require permanence. Augustine's voice grows gentle, almost pastoral. But Maurice, don't you see how tragic that makes existence? If truth is mortal, if meaning is temporary, if embodied experience is all there is, then every loss is final. Every death is absolute. Every moment of suffering is unredeemed. How do you bear the weight of such a world? The question hangs between them like a challenge and an invitation. Both men feel its weight, and for a moment, the philosophical debate becomes something more personal, more urgent. How indeed does one bear the weight of such a world? Something shifts in the tavern's atmosphere as Merleau-Ponty looks directly into Augustine's eyes. The intellectual sparring continues, but there's a new quality of vulnerability, as if both men are beginning to see not just each other's arguments, but each other's hearts. Augustine, let me tell you about the last time I saw my daughter before I died. She was playing in the garden, completely absorbed in building something with stones and leaves. I watched her small hands arranging and rearranging these simple materials, and I realized I was witnessing the birth of meaning itself. She wasn't discovering eternal truths. She was creating significance through the pure act of embodied engagement with the world. Augustine's expression softens, though his convictions remain firm. That's a beautiful image, Maurice. And I don't deny the beauty of such moments. But doesn't that very beauty point beyond itself? The love you felt watching your daughter, the sense of witnessing something precious and significant. Where does that come from, if not from the eternal realm of values that transcends any particular embodied experience? Merleau-Ponty shakes his head, but gently now, as if reluctant to dispel something precious. It comes from the embodied love of an embodied father, watching his embodied child engage with an embodied world. The meaning isn't located somewhere else. It's right there in that moment between those bodies in that garden. That's where meaning lives. But that moment ended, Augustine responds quietly. Your daughter grew up, you died, the garden changed. If meaning was truly located there in that specific embodied moment, then that meaning is gone forever. How is that not tragic? For the first time, Merleau-Ponty's voice carries a note of something like sadness. It is tragic, Augustine. Beautifully, meaningfully tragic. The fact that embodied existence is finite doesn't diminish its meaning. It concentrates it. Every moment becomes precious precisely because it won't last forever. Augustine leans forward, sensing something crucial in his opponent's admission. So you acknowledge the tragedy. You admit that embodied existence is fundamentally marked by loss, by limitation, by death. How then can you call it the source of meaning, rather than the source of suffering? Because suffering and meaning aren't opposites, Merleau-Ponty replies, his voice gaining strength. They're intimately connected. It's precisely because we have vulnerable bodies that can be hurt that we understand compassion. It's precisely because we love beings who will die that love becomes so powerful. It's precisely because meaning is fragile that it demands our care and attention. Augustine sits back, struck by something in this response. You know, in my younger years, I believed something similar. I thought that by fully embracing earthly pleasures and pains, I would find satisfaction. But the deeper I went into embodied experience, the more I realized it was fundamentally incomplete, always pointing beyond itself towards something it couldn't provide. But what if that sense of incompleteness isn't a flaw in embodied experience, but its very nature? Merleau-Ponty asks urgently. What if the fact that no single embodied moment can provide complete satisfaction isn't a problem to be solved, but the condition that keeps us engaged, keeps us reaching toward others, keeps us creating meaning through relationship and encounter? Augustine pauses, and for a moment there's something almost wistful in his expression. You're describing a kind of beautiful restlessness, Maurice. But restlessness was exactly what I wanted to escape. The endless seeking, the constant dissatisfaction, the perpetual incompleteness. I found peace only when I turned away from the flesh toward the eternal. But did you really find peace? Merleau-Ponty asks gently. Or did you find a kind of beautiful resignation? And is peace really what human existence is for? What if we're meant to be restless, meant to be engaged, meant to be constantly creating meaning through embodied encounter with an inexhaustible world? The question strikes something deep in Augustine, and he's quiet for a long moment. When he speaks again, his voice carries the weight of genuine self-examination. There are moments, Maurice, when I wonder if my peace came at too high a price. When I see young lovers walking together, when I witness the joy of parents with their children, when I observe the simple pleasure people take in food, in music, in touch. Sometimes I wonder if I transcended the body or simply fled from it. Merleau-Ponty's response is immediate and passionate. Augustine, that's exactly what I mean. You didn't transcend anything, you diminished yourself. You took the fullness of human existence and reduced it to pure spirit. But humans aren't pure spirits. We're embodied consciousness, and when we try to escape that, we lose something essential. But the appetites, the desires, the constant pull toward temporal things. Augustine objects, though with less certainty than before. How do you deal with the fact that embodied existence so often leads us away from what we know is good and true? Merleau-Ponty leans forward intensely. By engaging more deeply with embodied existence, not by fleeing from it. When desire becomes compulsive or destructive, it's usually because we've become disconnected from our embodied wisdom, not because we've listened to it too carefully. The body has its own intelligence, its own ethics, its own way of knowing what leads to flourishing. Augustine looks skeptical. The body has its own ethics. Maurice, bodies desire all sorts of things that are harmful. Excessive food, inappropriate sexual partners, violence, domination. How can you trust bodily wisdom when bodies so clearly can lead us astray? Because you're confusing embodied wisdom with impulsive reactivity, Merleau-Ponty responds. True embodied wisdom involves the whole person, not just immediate appetites, but long-term flourishing, not just individual satisfaction, but relationship with others, not just physical pleasure, but integrated meaning. When people act destructively, they're usually cut off from their deeper embodied wisdom, not following it. The fire has burned lower now, casting longer shadows across their faces. Both men seem to sense that they're approaching something crucial in their debate, not just an intellectual disagreement, but a fundamental choice about how to understand human existence itself. So we have two visions, Augustine says slowly. Mine, that the body is a prison from which the soul seeks liberation into eternal truth. Yours, that the body is the very condition of meaning, and attempts to transcend it, diminish rather than elevate human existence. Yes, Merleau-Ponty nods. And the choice between them isn't just philosophical, it's practical. It determines how we live, how we love, how we face suffering and death. The weight of this realization settles over them both. They're not just debating abstract concepts, they're wrestling with the most fundamental questions of human existence. The tavern has grown quieter around them, as if the world itself is leaning in to hear this ancient argument, played out between two of history's most profound thinkers. Augustine stares into his wineglass, swirling the dark liquid thoughtfully, and when he looks up, there's something raw and honest in his expression. "Maurice, let me tell you something I've never admitted to anyone. In my confessions, I wrote about my conversion as a moment of pure spiritual liberation. But the truth is more complicated. There are still nights when I lie awake remembering the weight of a lover's head on my shoulder, the taste of really excellent food, the simple pleasure of a warm bath after a long day, and I wonder, did I transcend these things, or just convince myself they didn't matter?" Merleau-Ponty sets down his glass carefully, clearly moved by this admission. "Augustine, what if both could be true? What if your spiritual insights were real and valuable, but your rejection of embodied experience was unnecessary? What if the transcendence you found could coexist with, rather than replace embodied meaning?" Augustine laughs, but it's a sound tinged with both humor and pain. "You're asking me to believe in a kind of both and, rather than either or. But my experience tells me that you can't serve two masters. Either the body is the path to truth, or it's an obstacle to truth. Either embodied existence is meaningful in itself, or it's meaningful only as a pointer beyond itself." "But why must it be either or?" Merleau-Ponty presses. "Consider music, Augustine. When you hear a beautiful piece of music, is the meaning in the eternal mathematical relationships that structure the harmonies, or is it in the embodied experience of sound waves touching your eardrums, moving through your body, evoking emotions and memories? Why not both?" Augustine considers this carefully. "Music is an interesting example. When I was young, I loved music so much that it frightened me. I was afraid it would become an end in itself, rather than pointing me toward God. So I disciplined myself to hear music only as a reflection of divine harmony." "And what happened?" Merleau-Ponty asks gently. I stopped hearing music," Augustine admits quietly. "I heard theological concepts illustrated by sound, but I stopped hearing music itself, the immediate, overwhelming, transformative power of music. I lost access to that." Merleau-Ponty nods slowly. "That's exactly what I mean, Augustine. In trying to transcend embodied experience, you didn't reach higher truth. You cut yourself off from a dimension of truth that's only available through embodied engagement. The meaning you found in music as divine harmony was real and valuable, but it didn't require sacrificing the meaning you found in music as embodied experience." Augustine is quiet for a long moment, and when he speaks, his voice carries the weight of someone reconsidering fundamental assumptions. "But if both are valid, how do you choose between them when they conflict? When bodily desires pull you toward actions that seem to violate spiritual principles, which do you trust?" "That's where the real wisdom lies," Merleau-Ponty responds with growing excitement. "Not in choosing spirit over body or body over spirit, but in developing the capacity to listen to both and find a way forward that honors the full complexity of human existence. Sometimes embodied wisdom will challenge spiritual abstractions. Sometimes spiritual insights will challenge immediate bodily impulses. The goal isn't to eliminate the tension, but to live creatively within it." Augustine shakes his head, but more in confusion than disagreement. "That sounds like a recipe for perpetual uncertainty, Maurice. How do you make moral decisions? How do you know when you're deceiving yourself? How do you distinguish between wisdom and rationalization?" "Through engagement with others," Merleau-Ponty replies immediately. "Through conversation like this one. Through testing your insights against the experiences and wisdom of other embodied beings. Through paying attention to the long-term consequences of your choices on your own flourishing and the flourishing of others." "But that makes truth democratic," Augustine objects. "What if the majority is wrong? What if cultural consensus supports practices that are genuinely harmful? Don't you need some transcendent standard to appeal to?" Merleau-Ponty pauses, recognizing the depth of the challenge. Not democratic in the sense of majority rule, but dialogical in the sense of ongoing conversation between perspectives. And yes, sometimes received wisdom is wrong. But the answer isn't to appeal to some supposedly transcendent standard. It's to deepen the conversation, to include more voices, to pay attention to those who are suffering under current arrangements. "You're describing a process without an endpoint," Augustine observes, "a conversation that never reaches final truth." "Exactly," Merleau-Ponty nods. "And that's not a flaw, That's the human condition. We're beings who create meaning through ongoing engagement, not beings who discover meaning once and for all. Augustine looks troubled. But without final truth, without ultimate meaning, how do you avoid despair? How do you find the strength to continue engaging when you know the conversation will never be resolved? For the first time in their debate, Merleau-Ponty seems to struggle for words. He looks into the fire, then back at Augustine, and when he speaks, his voice carries a note of something like faith. Because the conversation itself is what makes us human, Augustine. The fact that we can sit here, across 15 centuries, and wrestle with these questions, that's not a sign of our failure to find truth. That's truth itself. The capacity for embodied beings to encounter each other, to challenge each other, to create meaning together. That's the miracle. Augustine stares at him for a long moment. You're asking me to find meaning in the very process I've spent my life trying to transcend. I'm asking you to consider that what you tried to transcend might be what you were actually seeking all along. The fire crackles between them, and both men feel the weight of the choice they're articulating, not just for themselves, but for anyone who has ever wondered whether human existence is a problem to be solved or a mystery to be lived. The candles have burned lower, casting longer shadows across the tavern walls, and there's a sense that this conversation, impossible as it is, must soon reach some kind of resolution. Augustine traces the rim of his glass with one finger, his expression thoughtful and troubled. Maurice, I need to tell you something. Tonight, listening to you, I've felt something I haven't experienced in decades. Doubt. Not about God, not about the reality of the spiritual realm, but about whether my path toward transcendence was the only path toward truth. Merleau-Ponty leans forward, sensing the importance of this moment. What kind of doubt, Augustine? I'm remembering things I thought I had successfully left behind. The way my mother's hand felt when she was dying. The overwhelming joy I felt when I first understood a difficult passage in Plato. The simple pleasure of watching sunrise over the Mediterranean. I told myself these experiences were meaningful only as symbols, as pointers toward eternal truth. But what if they were meaningful in themselves? Augustine's voice carries a note of something like grief. What if, in transcending the body, I lost access to a dimension of meaning rather than finding a higher one? Merleau-Ponty's response is gentle but urgent. Augustine, it's not too late. Even now, even in this impossible conversation between the living and the dead, you're having an embodied experience. You're feeling the weight of the glass in your hand, seeing the firelight on my face, experiencing the complex emotions that come with reconsidering fundamental beliefs. This is embodied meaning-making happening right now. Augustine looks down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time in years. But the suffering, Maurice, the endless cycle of desire and disappointment that comes with embodied existence, how do you bear it without some promise of transcendence? By recognizing that suffering isn't the opposite of meaning, it's one of the ways meaning manifests in an embodied world, Merleau-Ponty replies. When you suffer because someone you love is dying, that suffering is the embodied expression of love itself. When you feel anguish over injustice, that anguish is your embodied moral sense responding to real harm. Suffering isn't a flaw in embodied existence, it's proof that embodied existence matters. Augustine is quiet for a long moment, and when he speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper. You're asking me to embrace the very thing I spent my life learning to transcend. I'm asking you to consider that transcendence might not mean escape from embodied existence, but deeper engagement with it. Instead of rising above the body, what if transcendence means integrating body and spirit so completely that the distinction becomes meaningless? Augustine looks up sharply. That sounds dangerously close to what I would call heresy, Maurice. If there's no distinction between body and spirit, then there's no distinction between temporal and eternal, finite and infinite, human and divine. Merleau-Ponty nods, unafraid of the implication. Exactly. What if those distinctions are useful for certain purposes but ultimately artificial? What if reality is more unified, more integrated than our philosophical categories suggest? But without those distinctions, how do you account for the human sense that existence is somehow incomplete, that we're always reaching for something beyond what we currently have? Augustine asks. Maybe that sense of incompleteness isn't evidence that something is missing. Maybe it's evidence that we're built for ongoing relationship, endless discovery, perpetual growth. Maybe the restlessness you felt in your youth wasn't a problem to be solved, but a fundamental feature of embodied consciousness that keeps us engaged with life. Augustine stands up slowly, moving to the fire. He stands there for a moment, Watching the flames, and when he turns back to face Merleau-Ponty, there's something different in his posture. Less defensive, more open. If you're right, Maurice, then I've wasted years trying to escape from the very thing that could have given my life meaning. I've treated my body as an enemy when it could have been an ally. I've sought truth in eternal abstractions when it was available all along in embodied engagement with the world. Merleau-Ponty shakes his head firmly. No, Augustine, not wasted. Your spiritual insights were real. Your experience of transcendence was genuine. The peace you found was valuable, but it was incomplete, not because it was wrong, but because it excluded half of human reality. So what are you suggesting? That I should have somehow combined my spiritual discipline with embodied pleasure? That I should have sought God through the flesh rather than in spite of it? I'm suggesting that maybe the choice between flesh and spirit was a false choice from the beginning. Maybe the goal isn't to choose one over the other, but to discover how they're already integrated in every moment of human existence. Augustine returns to his seat, but he's clearly agitated now, wrestling with implications that challenge everything he's built his life around. But the practices that led to my conversion, the discipline, the denial of bodily appetites, the turn away from temporal pleasures, those worked, Maurice. They led me to experiences of truth and peace I'd never found through embodied indulgence. I don't doubt that, Merleau-Ponty replies. But what if those practices worked not because they denied the body, but because they helped you develop a different relationship with embodied existence? What if fasting, for example, didn't transcend hunger, but helped you understand hunger more deeply? What if celibacy didn't transcend sexuality, but helped you understand the spiritual dimensions of embodied connection? Augustine sits back heavily, the weight of this reinterpretation clearly affecting him. You're suggesting that my spiritual practices were actually forms of embodied wisdom, rather than escapes from embodied existence. Exactly. And that opens up possibilities you may not have considered. Instead of seeing spiritual discipline as preparation for disembodied existence, what if you saw it as training for more conscious, more integrated embodied existence? The fire pops, sending sparks up the chimney, and both men watch them rise and disappear. There's a sense that they've reached something like the heart of their disagreement, not just about philosophy, but about how to live a human life. Augustine looks directly into Merleau-Ponty's eyes. If you're right, Maurice, then everything I've taught, everything I've written, everything I've built my reputation on, it's not exactly wrong, but it's profoundly incomplete. And if I'm wrong, Merleau-Ponty replies quietly, then I've spent my life celebrating a beautiful illusion while missing the eternal truths that could have given existence ultimate meaning. They sit in silence for a moment, each contemplating the magnitude of what they're debating. This isn't just academic philosophy. It's the choice between two fundamentally different ways of being human. The fire has burned down to glowing coals, and the tavern is bathed in their warm orange light. Both men seem somehow different than they were hours ago, not because either has abandoned his fundamental position, but because each has been genuinely changed by encounter with the other. Augustine speaks first, his voice carrying a new quality of integration. Maurice, I want you to know that tonight has changed something in me. Not my belief in God, not my conviction that there are spiritual realities beyond the physical world, but my understanding of how those realities relate to embodied existence. You've helped me see that perhaps I created an unnecessary opposition between flesh and spirit. Merleau-Ponty nods slowly, clearly moved. And you've helped me understand something crucial about my own position, Augustine. The hunger for transcendence that you describe, the sense that embodied existence points beyond itself. I think I've been too quick to dismiss that as illusion. Maybe there is something in human experience that genuinely reaches toward ultimacy, even if I understand that ultimacy differently than you do. Augustine leans forward, intrigued. How do you understand it? Maybe transcendence isn't escape from embodied existence, but the full realization of embodied existence. Merleau-Ponty responds thoughtfully. Maybe when we engage so completely with the world through our bodies that we lose the sense of separation between self and other, between consciousness and world. Maybe that's what transcendence actually is. Augustine considers this carefully. So you're saying that what I experienced as union with God might have been the deepest possible form of embodied consciousness rather than escape from embodied consciousness. It's possible, isn't it? What if the mystical experiences you describe, the sense of dissolution into divine love, the feeling of participating in eternal truth, what if those were moments when your embodied consciousness became so integrated, so complete, that it touched something universal? Augustine is quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with this reinterpretation. That would mean my spiritual practices were pointing me in the right direction, but my interpretation of what they accomplished was backwards. Not backwards, Merleau-Ponty corrects gently. Incomplete. The experiences were real, the insights were valuable, but the framework you used to understand them may have prevented you from integrating them fully with embodied existence. Augustine nods slowly. And if you're right, then the answer isn't to choose between body and spirit, but to discover how they're already unified. Exactly. And that opens up a completely different understanding of spiritual practice. Instead of disciplines designed to escape the body, what if we developed practices designed to inhabit the body more completely, more consciously, more lovingly? Augustine's eyes light up with recognition, like the way lovers touch each other with complete presence and attention, or the way a mother holds her child with total absorption, or the way mystics describe feeling held by divine love. Yes, Merleau-Ponty says excitedly, those are all forms of embodied transcendence, moments when the usual boundaries between self and world, between individual and universal, become permeable through intensely embodied experience. Augustine stands again, moving to the window this time. Outside, dawn is beginning to break, casting the first pale light across the landscape. You know, Maurice, there's something ironic about this conversation. Here we are debating whether embodied existence is meaningful, and we're doing it through the most embodied possible means. Face to face, voice to voice, presence to presence. Merleau-Ponty joins him at the window. And the meaning we're creating together couldn't exist in any other way. It's not reducible to the arguments we're making or the concepts we're exploring. It's emerging from the whole complex reality of two embodied consciousnesses engaging with each other. Augustine turns to face him. So, even this conversation is an example of your thesis. That meaning emerges from embodied encounter rather than being discovered through disembodied reasoning. But it's also an example of your thesis, Merleau-Ponty responds. We're reaching toward truths that transcend our individual perspectives, toward insights that feel universal, even though they're emerging from particular embodied exchange. Augustine laughs, and there's genuine joy in the sound. So perhaps we're both right in ways we didn't fully understand when we began. Perhaps the opposition between our positions was partly artificial, Merleau-Ponty agrees, created by philosophical categories that divide what's actually integrated in lived experience. They stand together at the window, watching the sun rise over a world that suddenly seems more complex and more hopeful than either of their original positions suggested. Augustine speaks first. What strikes me most about our conversation tonight is how it changed through the process of having it. The truth we've reached together isn't something either of us could have discovered alone. That's exactly right, Merleau-Ponty nods. Truth isn't a static thing we possess, but a dynamic reality we create through authentic encounter with others. And that process of creation is itself profoundly embodied. It requires presence, attention, vulnerability, the willingness to be changed by what we encounter. Augustine looks thoughtful. So perhaps the question isn't whether the body is a prison or the source of meaning, but how embodied beings can engage with each other and with the world in ways that generate meaning, truth, beauty, goodness, all the values we both care about. And how that process of meaning creation points towards something universal without requiring us to escape from the particular, something eternal without requiring us to reject the temporal. Augustine extends his hand to Merleau-Ponty, a gesture that embodies everything they've been discussing. Maurice, thank you for helping me see that transcendence and embodiment might not be enemies after all. Merleau-Ponty takes his hand warmly. And thank you, Augustine, for helping me see that embodied existence might indeed point towards something universal and ultimate, even if I understand that ultimacy differently than you do. As they shake hands, there's a sense of completion. Not because all questions have been answered, but because something new has been created through their encounter. The ancient opposition between flesh and spirit, between temporal and eternal, between human and divine, seems less absolute than it did at the beginning of the evening. The debate ends, but the conversation continues, as it must, as it always has, as it always will, wherever embodied beings gather to wrestle with the mystery of existence itself. The question of whether the body is prison or path to meaning may never be fully resolved, but perhaps that's exactly the point. Perhaps the question itself keeps us engaged, keeps us reaching toward each other, keeps us creating meaning through the very process of embodied dialogue. Outside the window, the world awakens to another day of embodied consciousness, struggling toward truth through encounter, presence, and the endless conversation between flesh and spirit that defines human existence itself. In the end, perhaps Augustine and Merleau-Ponty have discovered something more valuable than victory in their debate. They have discovered that the debate itself, conducted with honesty, vulnerability, and genuine care for truth, is one of the highest expressions of what it means to be embodied conscious beings in a world where meaning is both discovered and created through the mysterious alchemy of authentic encounter.